What am I doing? I don't know. I'm pretty tired. I went ice skating today on a lake that was frozen, obviously, and it was really bumpy. So it was a bit of a brain workout because I've never skated on bumpy ice before. And then somebody helped me fix my car door. The outside handle snapped and broke, and so I've had to climb in the passenger side for the last 3 weeks. And it was a bit of a debacle. I'll put a picture in of the broken lock. And the car, band-aided up. It was quite the process, but afterwards I just felt so good because that saved me $200. So I'm tired, but I'm also quite content. I thought to share a picture of what mania looks like, what it looked like for me the very first time I was in it. And as you'll be able to see from the picture, I was in a very ridiculous, silly, and playful state. And then 2 months later, probably, I was medicalized and pathologized and put on antipsychotics, and then I looked like this. I don't think I looked very happy. I definitely wasn't. And I had to go back to the hospital in order to get taken off those antipsychotics, and I'm so glad that I insisted on not being on them. I was put on an antidepressant instead, which I thought would be less harmful. And I think I was right, because I haven't been on them at all except for when I go to the psych ward. So when a doctor tried to put me on them long term in April in the psych ward, I just totally freaked out and went downhill very quickly. And luckily I was able to switch doctors and get off those antipsychotics and get the heck out of there. And I don't ever intend to go back unless I'm taken there by force. So I have to be extra careful of my distress levels. I have a few opportunities to share about something or other to help stop the stigma against mental illness, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't identify with having a mental illness. I never have. I've utilized the services because that's what has been made available to me, and I made the choice to go through that journey. But I never bought into, I have a mental illness. So I'm trying to think of a way I can still participate in those things and say things that are in the language that I would choose to speak about what others refer to as mental illness. I think of and refer to as something else. I refer to it as wonder and curiosity. I refer to it as transconsciousness, as neurodiversity, as being a different neurotribe of neuroemergence and neuroplasticity. For example, kids with autism, they're developing normally, whatever that means. And then something shifts and all of a sudden they're disconnected and they're different. And then turns out they're labeled with autism. That can happen to somebody in their late teens, early 20s, late 20s, whenever. Something shifts. Something shifts, and then all of a sudden the person is different. Autistic kids aren't called mentally ill because they've never really developed a personality yet through which to say, oh, your personality changed, so you must be mentally ill. They're just called autistic or on the autism spectrum or however you want to call it. Well, people who go through this experience later in life, autistic children avoid personality altogether, and people who go through trans consciousness are trying to decouple from the personality because it's kind of like a prison. It's a prison of the way we perceive ourselves, and the way we perceive ourselves is the way we're going to unfold ourselves. So to be labeled with a mental illness and then choose to perceive oneself as mentally ill, everyone has the right to do whatever they want. They can, if that's what is best, then they can go right ahead. I don't have a problem with that. I personally don't choose to think about myself that way. I think there's actually infinite ways to think about it, because the process itself is trying to get us to think differently, is trying to get us to think beyond and without the ego. And when we do that, we can think differently infinitely. So there's no one right way to think about it. It can keep unfolding. But as soon as we say, oh, it's a mental illness, then we stop thinking about it. And we stop wondering about our own brain. We stop wondering about that mysterious process that was initiated in our consciousness, in our brains. And we stop wondering about this plastic brain we have, this neuroplastic process. We're a process or processing processes. We're not an ego, we're not a thing. And if we are a thing, we have this body, but we don't actually abide in our body because we're so much in our head. And when the head gets scrambled, the ego gets scrambled, all of a sudden we realize we're in this body, we're in this perceptual apparatus, and we can see things so much more clearly. Anyway, that was a tangent. It just reminds me of Jason Silva's videos, because he talks of all of these perceptual experiences meant to expand our horizon and rearrange our mental models in order to incorporate and integrate it. That's exactly what map consciousness is. And we get tiny little glimpses throughout our life, and then we kind of chase that in a way. We're like, oh, how do I get that back? And then the people who go there and come back, they're not treated as, wow, you went there, maybe you have something to share with us. Maybe we can meet somewhere in the middle. Those people are silenced, and then people are left abstracting about the experience when a person was just fully immersed in the experience for weeks, for months. If we can get one glimpse and then wonder about awe, why are people that get a huge glimpse being pathologized and labeled and medicated out of going back into that experience? Those are just some thoughts. I feel like perhaps this isn't the time yet for these types of perceptions, but I'm free to create them in my own mind, because I don't have my mind blocked by the story of I have bipolar disorder. I've been labeled with bipolar disorder, but I understand it in a different way. Bipolar disorder is the psychiatric understanding, and that is the business of psychiatrists. And just like a person who's diagnosed with cancer might do mainstream treatment, and they might also do alternative treatment, in order to make it so the mainstream treatment is more successful, I'm creating alternative perspectives as well to go along with the mainstream perspective that I've been given. When we take something somebody else says and turn it against ourselves, it's not something we've discovered for ourselves, it's something we've been told. And then we can no longer discover anything for ourselves. And so our own voice gets turned against us. And when that voice is happening, we can't hear the voice of the universe. We can't hear our body talking to us. It stops communicating. I was actually wondering if the reason why there's so many more neural pathways from the heart to the brain versus from the brain to the heart, because it's almost like scar tissue in a way. Like the heart is trying so hard to communicate with the brain, and it could just have equal tracks from the heart to the brain as the brain to the heart. But since the brain's not listening to the heart's trying to create more neural pathways and more neural pathways and more neural pathways to hope that the brain will listen. And it's sending more and more and more signal until it finally sends so much signal that we're in fight or flight when there's no reason to be in fight or flight, which is sort of what happens in psychosis sometimes, where we're in fight or flight yet nothing's really happening. It's happening internally because it's like the heart finally is, the only message it can get through is fight or flight, is you haven't been listening to the subtle things all along, all throughout your life. So now you've walked through your life to a point where the heart has just given up, and it's like fight or flight, fight or flight. I can't give you anything else than fight or flight. That's all you can feel. You can't feel the subtleties. You can't see the subtleties. You can't hear the subtleties. So I was wondering if that's one of the reasons why we have so many more pathways from the heart to the brain. And that's something I just made up, but it just made me feel, it just made me think about how a tree will grow bigger and bigger roots when it needs to get the nutrients deeper and deeper. So there's some kind of nutrition that the heart's trying to give to the brain, but the brain's not listening, so it just makes thicker and thicker pathways until the brain finally hears. But when it does hear, it's just like terrifying. And we're talking ourselves out of life. By talking to ourselves, we're abstracting, and so we're not one with life. We're abstracting about the past, which is dead. So we're not actually living life. I was thinking about the lake and how, since it was frozen, there were people skating on the lake. And if it wasn't frozen, you wouldn't be able to skate on the lake. You could maybe canoe or swim if it was summertime. And it's the same water. It's just different conditions, and the different conditions change the medium. And I'm thinking about sort of how the brain, it's the same brain cells, but there's some kind of condition that changes in the brain that changes the medium of the brain in a way that different activities can be done. So in the normal consciousness medium, it's sort of like ego habit tracks. And then when we decouple from that and we're in the trans-conscious process, all of a sudden we're acting in different ways because it's a different medium. We're in touch with a different aspect of the brain, and it could just be a change in consciousness. It's all consciousness, but it's sort of like a higher temperature of consciousness, a higher level, a higher oxygenation of consciousness. And then we can see differently, and when we see differently, we act differently. It's kind of like how we don't question that Gaia, that the universe, that the cosmos, that Earth changes the weather, and it changes the conditions of the weather. We don't ever think that there's some factor that can change the conditions of our consciousness. And I was thinking about how most of the stuff we say in our heads to ourselves, we would never say out loud. So if we wouldn't say it out loud, why is it even worth repeating over and over again? We probably shouldn't hear our own voice unless we actually hear it speaking out loud. And they say if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. I would say if you don't have anything worth saying, don't think it. I was thinking about the blind spot again and how the brain fills in 50% of our visual field based on pattern. And I'm wondering about that. I feel like that 50% might actually be our creative space. So when we're in this passive habit mode, the brain has to fill in this 50%. But when we actually switch to perceiving, to seeing everything, we have that extra information available, and that is the moment, and we can respond to it. So in that way, the perception is a creative act because we're perceiving and acting in the moment, and then that's a creative process. It's not a passive process with our blind spot on. I feel like the blind spot could be the creation spot. Instead of allowing the brain to fill in that 50%, why aren't we filling that in? Or at least looking for what is actually there. The brain might fill it in because we've been made passive, because we're half asleep. And it could be the right side of our brain is the one that's sleeping. So they say we have this blind spot, but really we're just not using our whole brain. And the right side of the brain is for pattern recognition, but we're actually not recognizing patterns. And that's what happens when we go into map consciousness. We're recognizing patterns. So I'm actually realizing that we're just using our whole brain to perceive. We're not just using the linear, logical, abstracting side of our brain. And so all of a sudden we can recognize patterns. So we're probably recognizing the pattern in that blind spot area, in that so-called blind spot. It's not really a blind spot. We're just blind to that spot because we're not using that part of our brain that looks in that way. And that would be part of the information overload, is that all of a sudden we have access to more information because we're using our whole brain. And the right side of the brain isn't really valued in society, and it never has been. Just sort of realized that today, and I have no idea if it's true, but it seems to make some kind of sense. I feel we're either translating our memories or we can translate the universe. So we see and translate through our memories, and we think we are our memories, we think we're our past and our ego self. But when we don't think like that anymore, we can think with the universe. And we can translate the universe and translate what we see into words. And it's not like we would just say, oh, that's a flower, that's a word, that's a label. But we would see holistically, and we would see the pattern around the flower, and more information about the flower. It's like the flower is telling us its secrets. And if we could actually see the world in this way, we wouldn't want to destroy it because we would see the intelligence of it all. Just as gravity can be used to stretch our bodies, we can lean forward and stretch the back of our legs. Consciousness can stretch our brain cells, the field of consciousness. Leaning into the field of consciousness instead of being held by the ego.